Hayden Panettiere is dead at 36 years old, and I already know what happens when a celebrity dies this young and this unexpectedly, okay? People start investigating, people start trying to connect the dots, and they start over-examining every relationship, every interview, every struggle with addiction, every strange detail from the last few years of that person's life, trying to figure out exactly what happened. And with Hayden, there are a lot of dots. She publicly battled postpartum depression. She struggled with alcohol and opioid addiction. She even survived an abusive relationship. Now, her former boyfriend was arrested multiple times and eventually pleaded no contest to felony charges connected to domestic violence. There was a 5-year protective order. Okay, she lost her younger brother unexpectedly at only 28 years old. And just 3 months before Hayden passed away, she released a memoir where she finally told the full story of what she had been going through. But there's another part of this story that I don't think enough people know. Hayden says that when she publicly admitted she was suffering from postpartum depression, one of the biggest brands she had represented for years, Neutrogena, ended their relationship with her. And according to Hayden, there was a morality clause involved. Think about that. A woman tells the world she's suffering from a medical condition after giving birth, and somehow she becomes a potential problem for the brand? Neutrogena, you know y'all got to go to hell. So today, we are going to talk about Hayden's death, okay? We're going to talk about what we know, and we're going to talk about what we absolutely do not know, because y'all know how I do on my channel. We strictly doing the facts over here. And then we're going to talk about the psychology underneath a life that involved childhood fame, postpartum depression, addiction, domestic violence, grief, shame, and a public image that sometimes required Hayden to appear okay when she very clearly was not. So let's get into it. What's up, everybody? It's your girl, Indescribable, aka Geraldine Lake, and I'm back with another psychology breakdown. However, it's not going to be like we normally do. I'm going to establish some ground rules because this is an ongoing investigation. I usually am talking about fictional characters. Today, I'm talking about a real person, okay? And I want you guys to know that I am not diagnosing anybody that we're talking about, and we're not about to turn YouTube into CSI and try to solve with the autopsy that hasn't even been completed yet, okay? Everything I tell you about Hayden's psychology is going to come either from things Hayden herself publicly described or established psychological research that can help us understand those experiences. So let's start with what actually happened. Here's what we know about Hayden's death. She died Sunday, August 16th, 2026, and she was only 36 years old. She was found unresponsive at a residence in Greenville, South Carolina. According to authorities, an acquaintance called 911. Emergency personnel arrived and attempted life-saving measures, but Hayden was pronounced dead at the scene. Police have said their preliminary investigation found no signs of foul play or suspicious circumstances. And as I'm recording this video, her official cause of death has not been determined, okay? Now, there is another detail being reported. Dispatch audio reportedly described an apparent overdose and cardiac arrest. That's relevant information, but an apparent overdose reported over dispatch is not the same thing as a medical examiner determining a cause of death. So, until toxicology and the autopsy are complete, we cannot say that this is a cause of death, even when the authorities haven't put that on her death certificate. And this is especially important because everybody knows about her history with addiction. It becomes very easy to say, well, you know, she struggled with drugs and alcohol, so obviously, no, you can go to hell too, okay? Medical history is not an autopsy report. We'll talk about Hayden's addiction because Hayden talked extensively about it. But we're not going to use her past to manufacture a certainty surrounding the circumstances of her death, okay? We watched this woman grow up. Part of the reason Hayden's death feels so shocking is because she's one of those celebrities who's seemingly always been here. Hayden started working when she was literally a baby. She appeared on One Life to Live and Guiding Light. Then came movies like Remember the Titans. But for a whole generation, Hayden Panettiere became Hayden Panettiere when she played Claire Bennett on Heroes. Save the Cheerleader, Save the World. Then she eventually became Juliette Barnes on Nashville, where she earned 2 Golden Globe nominations. And this is where the story gets a little bit sad, because while Hayden was playing a woman struggling emotionally on television, her real life was becoming increasingly difficult behind the scenes as well. So let's talk about the postpartum depression. Hayden gave birth to her daughter Kaya in December 2014, and after giving birth, Hayden developed postpartum depression, and she eventually talked about it publicly. In her memoir, she described meeting her newborn daughter and experiencing an almost complete absence of emotion. She expected this enormous wave of maternal love. Instead, she felt kind of numb. She described feeling as though her soul was dead. Now imagine the shame that can create. Because motherhood is constantly marketed to women as this immediate transformation. Here's your baby. Here's your purpose. Here's the happiest day of your life. And Hayden was sitting there thinking, well, why don't I feel what I'm supposed to feel? Postpartum depression is a legitimate mental health condition. It can involve severe sadness, hopelessness, anxiety, emotional numbness, difficulty bonding with the child, changes in sleep and appetite, and feelings of worthlessness. And having postpartum depression does not mean that somebody doesn't love their child. But Hayden was dealing with something else at the same time. She was also extremely famous. She wasn't just experiencing postpartum depression privately. Eventually, she had to decide whether she was going to tell the public. And when she finally did, according to Hayden, it cost her professionally. So here's the Neutrogena story. This part actually pissed me off, and you're going to hear a lot of go to hells, okay? Hayden had worked with Neutrogena for years. She had been one of their celebrity faces. This wasn't some little 3-month Instagram partnership, okay? She had a long-standing relationship with this company. In September of 2015, Hayden appeared on Live with Kelly and Michael and publicly discussed her postpartum depression.
When they tell you about postpartum depression, you think about, okay, I feel negative feelings towards my child. I want to injure my child. I want to hurt my child. I've never, ever had those feelings. And some women do, but you don't realize what broad of a spectrum you can really experience that on. And it's something I think that needs to be talked about, and women need to know that they're not alone.
Later on, she entered treatment. And according to Hayden's own account, Neutrogena wanted out. Hayden explained in 2026 that her contract contained a morality clause. Now, normally when we hear morality clause, we're thinking somebody got arrested, right? Somebody had a giant public scandal. Somebody did something that could actually embarrass the company. Hayden was talking about postpartum depression, a condition associated with childbirth. And she said that after she opened up publicly about what she was experiencing, she was told by Neutrogena that they wanted to fire her. Her representation apparently pushed back. But according to Hayden, they essentially said, you can't fire this woman because she has postpartum depression. She said she remained under contract through the end of the year, but was not brought back afterward. And in her memoir, Hayden wrote that Neutrogena canceled her long-standing contract during this period. Now, I want to be precise here. This is Hayden's account of what happened. I don't have no internal emails from Neutrogena. I don't know what executives said in a conference room. I'm just telling you what Hayden said happened to her. And psychologically, I can't imagine the message that would send to a woman who's already struggling. She already don't understand why she doesn't feel like herself. And then you finally tell people the truth. And one of the professional consequences, according to Hayden, is that a company you've represented for years suddenly decides you're no longer somebody they want representing their image. Well, what exactly was immoral about being depressed? Having a baby and not immediately floating around the house like Snow White with birds, helping you fold the laundry? What are we actually talking about here? And this is why the stigma surrounding it matters, because when people say we need to talk about mental health, that sounds beautiful until somebody actually isn't doing well. Now, everybody supports mental health when mental health looks like yoga and journaling and talking about a personal day. It becomes much less marketable when somebody is in treatment. Hayden learned that lesson publicly. Now let's talk about what happens when emotional pain meets alcohol. Hayden later revealed that during her postpartum depression, she began using alcohol to change how she felt. In her memoir, she described trying to essentially manufacture her own happiness. She knew alcohol could temporarily change her emotional state, and this is where addiction psychology becomes very important. The brain learns from relief. If you're experiencing unbearable emotional distress and something temporarily makes that distress disappear, your brain remembers that. That doesn't mean everyone who drinks when they're sad develops an addiction, obviously. But for someone who is vulnerable to substance use problems, that relief can become very reinforcing. I feel horrible, so I drink. Well, now I temporarily feel better, okay? My brain is going to remember that. But then the emotional pain comes right back, and then the cycle repeats itself. Now, eventually, the thing you're using to escape your suffering starts creating additional suffering. Hayden eventually became very open about the severity of her addiction to alcohol and opioids. At one point, she said a doctor warned her that continuing to drink at that level could kill her within 5 years. Knowing that now is kind of bone-chilling. But again, that does not tell us how Hayden died. Her official cause of death remains pending, okay? We're going to stick to the facts here. Then came Brian Hickerson. After Hayden's relationship with Vladimir Klitschko, I hope I said that right. When that relationship ended, she became involved with Brian Hickerson, and this relationship became extremely volatile. Hickerson was arrested in May 2019 following an alleged domestic violence incident involving Hayden. There were additional legal problems. Then in February 2020, he was arrested again following another alleged incident involving her. By 2021, Hickerson pleaded no contest to 2 felony counts of injuring a spouse or girlfriend. He was sentenced to just 45 days in county jail. He received probation. He was ordered to attend domestic violence classes, and there was a 5-year protective order requiring him to stay away from Hayden. That's important because when we describe this relationship as abusive, we're not basing that solely on somebody's interpretation of an argument they saw on Instagram, okay? This was a criminal case. There was a plea. There was a sentence. And years later, Brian Hickerson himself publicly acknowledged the abusive behavior. Now, why did she go back? This is where people get judgmental, of course, because Hayden continued having contact with Brian even after everything that happened. And people are like, girl, why? Why would you continue to go back to be with somebody who did that to you? But intimate partner violence research tells us that leaving abusive relationships can be extremely complicated. There can still be emotional attachment and fear. There can be hope that the person has changed. There can also be isolation. There can be financial issues. There can be psychological manipulation and periods where everything seems wonderful again. And sometimes the person who hurts you is also the person you have learned to seek comfort from. That is a psychologically confusing place to exist. Years later, Hayden acknowledged that feelings between them remained, and she indicated that any continued relationship depended on his recovery. Now, you can look at that from the outside and say, baby, absolutely not, okay? And that's fine. But hypothetical strength is very easy. It's easy to know exactly what you would do in a relationship you've never been in. Something Hayden said this year really stuck with me because she talked about how embarrassing the situation was for her, because Hayden saw herself as strong and resilient and independent.
For the first time, she reads what she has never said out loud.
I realized that I was more afraid of being alone than being abused. And in order to be around that kind of behavior, it took me dulling my senses and numbing myself with substances in order to silence that rational voice in my head that was telling me exactly what was going on.
So part of her internal conflict became, how could somebody like me allow this to happen? And that's exactly why stereotypes about domestic violence are very dangerous. People imagine an abused woman as somebody meek and helpless. Hayden was rich, famous, beautiful, successful. I mean, she had access to resources most people don't have. And she still found herself struggling to completely separate from an abusive relationship. Because abuse is not an IQ test, okay? You don't get immunity because you're intelligent. You don't get immunity because you have money, and strength doesn't switch off the attachment. And I want to pause for a moment to just share something a little bit personal. I have been in this space, okay? And now, I'm not nearly as famous as Hayden is, but having a large platform as what people would call an influencer or just a content creator, there's a reason why I don't put my relationships in the spotlight, not because I feel like I'm being isolated or separated from people, but because of conversations like these surrounding abuse and leaving, and there's so much judgment, and people always have something to say. As a person who's been in that position, it doesn't matter how pretty, smart, talented, wealthy, etc. you are. When your heart decides that it is connected to someone, that cognitive dissonance, it doesn't allow for a clean break all the time. Sometimes you have to go through it multiple times in order to leave. And I believe psychologists say it takes a woman on average 7 times to leave an abusive situation. So I never judge women when I see that they're in something where they feel stuck. A lot of times there's financial manipulation and abuse. A lot of times there are children involved. The families are involved. So I wouldn't dare sit here and make claims that she should have left or should have left sooner or anything like that, because that's just, it's not logical to feel that way when you're in the middle of something that's just not that cut and dry. But then Brian talked about the abuse, and this happened just months before Hayden died. While Hayden was promoting her memoir, Brian Hickerson publicly responded to what she wrote, and he acknowledged his abusive behavior. There was one particular incident Hayden included in the memoir that he apparently wished she hadn't. He described being drunk and threatening Hayden with a phone. Now, according to his account, he gave her seconds to run before threatening to throw it at her. And apparently this was the story he didn't particularly want in the book. Sir, go to hell, okay? Because if you wanted somebody to talk about you in a positive light, you should have lived a positive life. You don't get to control the narrative when you've been a monster, because imagine surviving something terrifying and then having the person responsible worrying about whether your story makes them look bad. Once again, please, shut the hell up and go to hell. And I know you're grieving, but you can still go to hell, okay? But I also want to be fair about what he did say. Hickerson acknowledged responsibility for the abusive behavior. He discussed his own recovery. He did express remorse, and those things belong in the story too. Now, accountability doesn't erase what happened. You can still go to hell, all right? Now let's talk about that 5-year protective order, because people are already connecting this to Hayden's death. As part of Hickerson's April 2021 sentence, he was ordered to stay away from Hayden for 5 years. That brings us to 2026. There has been discussion online about when exactly that order expired, but I have not found reliable documentation establishing that the protective order specifically expired in August of 2026. And I'm not going to tell y'all something happened this month just because it makes the timeline more dramatic. What we can verify is that it was a 5-year order originating in 2021. We also know that Hayden and Brian had been seen around each other again, and reporting earlier this year indicated that they remained in contact. But here's where I'm drawing a very thick line, okay? As of this recording, police have reported no signs of foul play in Hayden's death. There's currently no credible evidence establishing that Brian Hickerson caused her death. His documented history of abusing Hayden deserves discussion, okay? And we will talk about it. But that does not give us permission to accuse that man of ending her life, okay? If investigators uncover something different, then we'll deal with those facts when those facts exist. Let's backtrack a little bit to February of 2023 when Hayden's younger brother, Jansen, died suddenly. He was only 28 years old. His family later said he died from an enlarged heart with complications involving his aortic valve. Hayden was devastated, and she later talked publicly about how profoundly his death had affected her. Sibling grief can be enormous because siblings often occupy a very specific psychological space in our lives. They carry our history. They knew us before our adult identities existed. And Hayden had already spent years fighting her way through postpartum depression, addiction, treatment, relationship trauma, and public scrutiny. Then she loses her little brother too? She later described herself as heartbroken by his death. And we got to be careful here too, because grief isn't a diagnosis. There's no mathematical equation where the trauma plus that trauma equals a particular outcome. I'm just saying that this woman had experienced an extraordinary amount of emotional loss. 3 months before she died, she told the story. This is probably the saddest part of it for me. Her memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, came out in May of this year, 2026, 3 months before her death. And in that book, she finally put all these pieces together. The childhood fame, the motherhood, the postpartum depression, alcohol addiction, treatment, domestic abuse, her daughter, her brother, shame, recovery. Imagine spending years living through experiences that other people are constantly interpreting for you and finally just saying, no. Let me tell you what actually happened here. And then 3 months later, you're gone. That is devastating. When I look at Hayden's story, I don't see a diagnosis that explains everything, and I don't think we should be looking for one, right? I see a person, a human being who experienced multiple major stressors across different stages of her life. I see somebody who became famous before she was old enough to really understand fame. I see a woman who developed postpartum depression and then says she experienced professional consequences after admitting it publicly. I see a woman who developed serious problems with substances while trying to cope with emotional pain. I see somebody who experienced domestic violence and then felt ashamed that she couldn't simply switch her heart off, turn off her feelings, so to speak. I see somebody who lost her younger brother unexpectedly and who eventually decided to tell the truth about all of it. None of that tells us why Hayden passed away. It tells us something about how she lived. And I think that's a much more responsible conversation for us to be having today. Here's what Hayden's story should teach us. We need to stop treating mental health awareness like a catchy slogan, because Hayden's story exposes a contradiction. We tell people to speak up and ask for help. Tell somebody that you're struggling. And then somebody actually does that, and suddenly everybody's uncomfortable. A celebrity says she has postpartum depression, and now somebody is worried about whether or not she's still marketable. A woman admits she returned to an abusive partner, and suddenly everybody wants to know why she wasn't strong enough to leave. A person with addiction relapses and people say, see, they didn't really want to get better. That is not compassion, y'all. And she deserves more than that. Now, here's what we're not going to do, okay? We are not diagnosing this woman. We are not declaring that she relapsed. We're not saying an overdose killed her simply because dispatch audio reportedly used that language. We're not even accusing Brian Hickerson of having something to do with her death. We are not turning the protective order into evidence of a crime. And we're not pretending that every difficult experience Hayden had led her to August 16th. We don't know that, okay? What we know is that she died at 36. Authorities are investigating. The preliminary investigation has found no signs of foul play. Her official cause of death remains pending, and until that changes, that's where the facts stop. But Hayden's story doesn't stop with the circumstances of her death, because she spent 36 years here. She gave us Claire Bennett. She gave us Juliette Barnes. She gave us Kirby Reed. She was a child star who successfully transitioned into adult acting when plenty of child actors never managed to do that. She became one of the famous women willing to publicly say, I'm experiencing postpartum depression. She eventually spoke openly about her addiction. She spoke openly about domestic violence. I mean, she spoke openly about her grief. And 3 months before her death, she put the story in her own words. So maybe instead of spending the next few days trying to figure out how Hayden died before the medical examiner can tell us the facts, we can spend some time listening to what Hayden was trying to tell us about the way that she chose to live. Because some of those conversations are bigger than Hayden Panettiere. They're about what happens when we punish people for admitting that they are not okay. It's about why survivors sometimes return to the people that hurt them, and about why addiction is more complicated than just stop. It's about why a woman can be strong and still need help, and about how somebody can seemingly have everything and still be suffering behind closed doors. So rest in peace, Hayden. 36 years is obviously way too young, and hopefully the last chapter of her story will be told with the same thing she seemed to be asking for while she was alive. Just a little more understanding. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you know every single time I upload. If there are updates to this investigation, I will include them here. And I will catch you guys in the next video. Make sure you take care of yourselves, love on yourselves and your loved ones. And I'll see you next time. Peace.